Joining us now is a member of the House Judiciary Committee who was inside that meeting, and that is Maryland Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin. It's good to see you, Congressman. Take us inside that room. How did the debate play out?
Well, I wish I could, but really those meetings are supposed to be off the record. I was pretty amazed that everything seemed to leak out almost simultaneously. But look, obviously we're involved in a serious conversation here, which is how do you deal with the most lawless and obstructionist administration of our lifetimes? And those of us, or many of us on the Judiciary Committee, have been exposed to this overwhelming evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors. And it was reported by Special Counsel Mueller that there were at least 10 or 11 episodes where the president interfered with the law enforcement investigation being conducted by the special counsel. So that's staring us in the face. And now what we have is a president who has expanded the strategy of obstruction to obstruct Congress. And he's acting in blatant defiance and contempt of our lawful powers under Article 1 of the Constitution. So the question isn't whether to impeach or not to impeach. The question is whether or not to launch an inquiry into whether there were high crimes and misdemeanors and what Congress should do about it.
Well, look, if you're going to talk about lawlessness, if you're going to talk about obstructionist behavior, and I think that virtually everyone in that caucus, your caucus, would agree with you about what's happening here. Obviously, for people like Nancy Pelosi and others, there is a political reality about whether an impeachment vote, for example, could get through. So even given that, is Nancy Pelosi being too careful here?
Well, you know, we love Nancy Pelosi precisely because she is careful and, you know, she's a great political strategist. So we have to take very seriously everything that she's saying. And it's a dilemma for all of us because.
But you simply disagree with her.
Well, let's put it like this. The impeachment is the last line of constitutional self-defense that the people in the Congress have against a lawless president who is trampling the Constitution and acting like a king. But impeachment asks us to decide both a question of law and a question of politics. And the question of law is whether there were high crimes and misdemeanors, which we take to be public offenses against the state and against the people through the Constitution. But it also asks us to ask the political question, which is how does impeachment fit in with everything else we're doing? And I think that's the discussion we're having, and it's a completely legitimate and valid discussion. And obviously will go on as we struggle to deal with this administration, which is shutting down all of our requests for subpoenas, shutting down all of our requests for witnesses and documents. So this is an unprecedented situation we're in, and so we appreciate the fact that all of us are on the same team trying to figure out how to deal with it.
So given that point, you believe starting the process will give you access to information. If you have an inquiry, you can get more of that information. But then there are people like your colleague, Hakeem Jeffries, who asked this question, and I'm quoting him here: why would we open an impeachment inquiry if we're winning in the court system? How do you answer that question?
Well, we're winning in the court system. Our victories against the White House saying basically they don't have to cooperate with Congress's demands for information. The reason that we want that information is we want to determine whether there were high crimes and misdemeanors and also what we can do to try to clear out the corruption in the executive branch. For example, on the Oversight Committee where I serve as well, we have an investigation going on into the White House Personnel Office where 25 people were rejected by the professional staff in terms of getting their security clearance. They were overruled by the White House, by the president, who said, let's grant security clearance to people who were found totally not qualified to have it. So we're doing an investigation into that. They've shut us down on that, and we're trying to fight that out in court as well. So we will continue to fight in court. We will continue to fight in the court of public opinion. And if it comes to it, we will launch an impeachment inquiry. So all of these are tools in the constitutional toolkit that we have to deal with the lawlessness of the administration.
So to the court of public opinion and to the political reality of impeachment or even an impeachment inquiry, and we were talking about this just a short time ago. There's a big article in the New York Times. They go to Youngstown and they talk to folks there, people who have left the Democratic Party, or at least as voters have left the Democratic Party. I'm going to reread something that I read earlier from one guy who said the Democratic Party has lost its voice to speak to people that shower after work and not before work. All we're saying is he won't turn over the tax returns. He's saying, I'm fighting China to get you a better job. Does this make the Democrats look like they're not on the same page as a lot of the people that Democrats say they want to fight for, they want to defend, they think are being hurt under this administration?
Well, look, we have been fighting to lower prescription drug prices, and we just passed very important legislation on that last week. We fought to pass
That's not
the
going to get
Equality
through the
Act.
Senate.
Well, and there's the problem. The same kind of obstruction we're getting from the White House in terms of the truth, we're getting from the Senate in terms of everything we want to do, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's gun violence and gun safety legislation, which we've passed, whether it's environmental protection. We're getting a complete shutdown from this party of obstruction. That's the problem that we're dealing with.
Congressman Raskin, always appreciate you coming on the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.